If your grandchild walked into a 1958 classroom today, they'd think they'd stumbled into a museum exhibit, not a school. We're talking about a world where teachers didn't negotiate with students, where a child's day was structured with rituals so precise they'd make a military sergeant nod approvingly, and where nobody questioned whether any of it was unusual. But here's what's fascinating. Those rules weren't always about discipline for discipline's sake. Many of them grew from a genuine belief about what children needed, and when you sit with them, you begin to understand the fabric of a completely different kind of childhood. So come with me as we count down 7 school customs from the 1950s and 60s that would absolutely baffle a modern kid and maybe, just maybe, help us understand what we've gained and what we've left behind. Let's start at number 7, where things still feel somewhat familiar, even if the execution would raise eyebrows now. Penmanship class with actual fountain pens and India ink. You remember how important handwriting was, don't you? Not as an afterthought, but as a dedicated period in the day, sometimes twice weekly, where children sat at their desks with proper posture, learned to hold a pen at exactly the right angle, and practiced the Palmer method. Those loops and swoops that made every child's writing look almost identical by the time they finished elementary school. The smell of that India ink is something many of us can still conjure, slightly musty, almost medicinal. The ink bottles with their cork stoppers sat in the center of each desk cluster, and someone, usually the most careful student, was responsible for filling everyone's wells without spilling. A single blotch was considered a small tragedy. The teacher would walk the aisles with a ruler, checking that your grip was correct, that your posture was straight, that your letters had the right slant. The philosophy behind it was unquestionable. Beautiful handwriting was a mark of education, of respect, of civilization itself. A child's penmanship would follow them into adulthood, into their career, into their very character. We didn't have keyboards then. We had our hands, and our hands had to be trained. Now we move to number 6, and here we encounter something that feels almost quaint from our current vantage point, the sheer volume of pure memorization that was expected. Multiplication tables, yes, you had to know them cold, without hesitation, all the way through the 12s, sometimes the 15s. But it went far beyond that. Poetry memorization was standard curriculum. Children would stand and recite Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, or The Charge of the Light Brigade from memory, often perfectly, or face a poor mark. State capitals, the order of the presidents, the bones in the human body, the capitals of European nations, these weren't things you could look up. These were things that had to live in your mind. There was something almost sacred about this approach, a belief that a well-trained mind was one that could hold knowledge securely, that could be called upon to produce information without external aids. A student's memory was seen as a muscle, and memorization was the exercise that built it. Teachers believed, and perhaps they were onto something, that the act of drilling these facts into your brain created neural pathways that somehow made you sharper, more capable, better able to learn new things. Whether that's scientifically true or not, the cultural value placed on it was absolute. You either knew your times tables or you didn't. There was no gray area, and certainly no calculator to hide behind. At number 5, we arrive at something that would cause genuine confusion among children today, the dress codes, and more specifically, the enforcement of them. For boys, it was relatively straightforward, shirts tucked in always. Belts were mandatory, not optional, and a boy could be sent home if his belt was missing or deemed insufficiently formal. Hair had to be trimmed above the collar and ears, neat and orderly. For girls, the rules were far more elaborate and, frankly, more intrusive. Skirts had to be a certain length. Most schools required that when a girl knelt down, her skirt touched the floor or come no higher than an inch above it. Can you imagine? An actual physical test for modesty, conducted right there in the hallway. Girls were sometimes made to kneel in front of a teacher or principal to have their hem length verified. Hair had to be a certain way too, no excessive curls, no wild styles, nothing that suggested vanity or distraction. Nail polish was often forbidden or limited to pale shades. Some schools wouldn't allow girls to wear pants at all, it was skirts or dresses exclusively. The reasoning was clear enough. Appearance reflected character, and schools saw themselves as guardians of that character. A neat appearance meant a neat mind. A girl in a short skirt was a distraction to the boys, to the learning environment, to the very mission of the school itself. It seems almost incomprehensible now, but it was treated with absolute seriousness. A girl could be pulled from class for a dress code violation. Her education would pause while the hem of her skirt was measured. Number 4 brings us to something that strikes modern parents as genuinely shocking: children walking to school alone, from extraordinarily young ages. We're talking about 6- and 7-year-olds, sometimes younger, leaving home without adult supervision and walking, sometimes for miles, to get to school. A first grader might navigate 3 or 4 blocks, cross streets, walk past neighborhoods entirely unsupervised. By the time a child was 9 or 10, solitary walks of 2 or 3 miles were completely normal. There was an implicit trust in the neighborhood, in the community, in the child's own capability. A child was expected to be observant, careful, responsible. The culture didn't suggest that danger lurked around every corner. Children were seen as capable of managing basic navigation and decision-making at ages, when today's children are often still being driven to school in car seats. There's something almost poignant about this in retrospect: a faith in the world, a faith in children's competence, a belief that independence came early and that the walk itself was part of the education. The physical conditioning of it, the problem-solving of navigating streets and traffic, the simple habit of moving through the world on your own terms, these were seen as valuable developmental experiences, not risks to be mitigated. At number 3, we reach something that feels almost absurdly specific and yet was taken with complete seriousness: classroom jobs. Every child had one. The blackboard monitor would erase the board at the end of the day and make sure the chalk was aligned just so. The milk monitor would distribute the small bottles of cold milk at mid-morning. Every school had this, and collect the empties. The door monitor would stand at attention when guests entered. The window monitor would ensure the blinds were properly adjusted. The attendance monitor would walk the roll to the office. The paper monitor would distribute materials and collect assignments. Some children were line leaders, responsible for making sure the class walked quietly and orderly to the gymnasium or the cafeteria. These weren't just quaint little tasks. They were given out with real significance. A child took pride in their job. It was seen as training for responsibility, for the idea that everyone had a role to play in the functioning of the community. A child who was careless with their classroom job could lose it, and this was considered a genuine consequence, a mark against their record and their character. There was no participation trophy for showing up. Your job was your job, and you either did it well or you didn't. In a strange way, it was both democratic and hierarchical. Everyone had responsibility, but some jobs were considered more prestigious than others. The milk monitor was a position of some importance. At number 2, we find ourselves in something almost difficult to describe to someone who didn't live through it: the duck and cover drills. Beginning in the early 1950s and extending through the 60s, children would practice taking shelter in the event of a nuclear attack. The sirens would sound, that particular wail that children learned to dread and anticipate, and you would crouch under your desk or line the hallway against the wall, your hands over your head. The absurdity of this protection was not discussed with children. You didn't question whether hiding under a wooden desk would actually save you from a nuclear blast. You simply did it, over and over, until the motion became almost automatic. The drills happened regularly enough that children developed a kind of grim familiarity with them. Some children found them terrifying, others treated them as a break from regular classwork. But they reflected something very real about the time: the ambient anxiety of the Cold War, the genuine fear that nuclear catastrophe might come without warning, the school's attempt to do something, anything, to make children feel safe. Whether or not the drills had any practical value, they had immense cultural and psychological weight. They normalized the idea that danger could arrive at any moment. They were part of the texture of mid-century American childhood, woven into the daily routine as surely as lunch period or the Pledge of Allegiance. And now, we arrive at number 1, and this is the moment we've been building toward, because this one detail, more than any dress code or memorization requirement, crystallizes something fundamental about the relationship between students and teachers, between children and authority, between the structure of school itself. Every single child in the classroom stood up when the teacher entered the room. Every time. It wasn't a spontaneous gesture of respect that happened to emerge organically, it was a formal expectation. The teacher would open the door, and without being told, without a signal, the entire room would rise. Chairs would scrape backward, rustling of textbooks and pencils, and every face would turn toward the doorway. The teacher would nod acknowledgement, and then the children would sit back down in perfect silence. This happened at the beginning of the day, after recess, after lunch, after assemblies, whenever the teacher left and then returned, the same ritual repeated. And here's what strikes me about it now, looking back. This gesture contained an entire philosophy of education. It said that the teacher was not a peer, not a facilitator, not a friend. The teacher was an authority figure, and that authority was not something earned through charisma or relatability, it was inherent in the role. A teacher deserved respect because they were a teacher. The standing was a physical acknowledgement of that hierarchical truth, and children learned it so young and so completely that it became second nature. Do you remember what it felt like, that moment of rising together? The synchronized motion of 30 or 40 children in a single room, the small sounds of everyone standing at once, the way the teacher's entrance seemed to command the very air. It was theatrical in a way, and yet it felt completely ordinary at the time. It was how things were. What's remarkable is that no one had to enforce this very often. Children had learned the expectation so thoroughly that they did it automatically. If a child forgot and remained seated, there would be a pause, a look, and the child would immediately stand, suddenly aware of their transgression. But mostly, it just happened. The morning bell would ring, the teacher would arrive, and the room would rise. It was a ritual as automatic as standing for the national anthem, and it communicated something profound. You are in a structured environment with clear hierarchies and expectations, and your job is to understand and participate in those structures without question. Now, none of these customs exist anymore, and we live in a world that made deliberate choices to move away from them. Penmanship gave way to typing and now to keyboards. Memorization was supplemented, then replaced, by the ability to research and find information. Dress codes became controversial and have been largely relaxed or abandoned. Children are driven to school or ride school buses rather than walking alone. Classroom jobs have diminished significantly. The Cold War ended, and those drills stopped. And most tellingly, the standing when a teacher enters? That's gone entirely. Teachers and students now have a much more informal relationship. Some teachers introduce themselves by their first names. The hierarchy is softer, the interaction more negotiated. What strikes me, reflecting on all of this, is that these customs weren't random or arbitrary. They were coherent expressions of a particular theory of education and child development. They assumed that children needed structure, that respect for authority was important, that some knowledge had to be committed to memory rather than looked up, that appearance reflected character, that independence could be developed by giving children real responsibilities, and that the teacher-student relationship had an inherent formality that should be honored. Whether one agrees with that philosophy or not, it was consistent. It made sense. And yet, we have gained so much. Children are safer because we don't send 6-year-olds walking alone for miles. Students have more agency and voice in their own education. We've become more flexible about dress codes and personal expression. We've recognized that rigid hierarchies can sometimes stifle creativity and genuine learning. The relationship between teachers and students can be warmer, more human, less about performance, and more about authentic connection. But something has shifted, hasn't it? Some indefinable quality of those ritual moments, the standing, the synchronized motion, the clarity of expectation, those seem to have carried a kind of weight that's harder to find in modern classrooms. There's something worth remembering about a structure that everyone understood so completely that you didn't have to think about it, you just did it. So here's my question for you. Do you remember those rituals from your own school days? That specific feeling of rising with everyone else when the teacher entered? Or perhaps the smell of that India ink, or the anxiety of those drills? I'd love to hear what you remember. What stands out to you from that era? Please share in the comments below. Those memories are what keep this history alive. And if you've enjoyed this little walk down memory lane with me, please subscribe to Porch Light Memories. We'll be here every week, reminding each other of the world as it was, not to judge it or to wish we could return to it entirely, but simply to remember it clearly, to honor it, and to understand what it meant to grow up in those particular times and places. Thank you for remembering with me.